Hey, I'm Matt Valley, and welcome to another episode of the Rock and Roll Research Podcast, where we share the super cool backstories and side gigs of the research and insights pros that you trust. Today's distinguished guest is Steve Cohen, who's the co-founder of In4mation Insights, who really is the best in the business when it comes to applying analytics to business decision-making. Now, I first met Steve back in 2011. When he was the recipient of the American Marketing Association's Charles Coolidge Parlin Award, which is given for outstanding lifetime contributions to the field of marketing research. So since then, Steve has also been elected to the New York City Marketing Research Council's Marketing Research Hall of Fame. He has been the recipient of the Buck Weaver Award for lifetime contributions in marketing science. More on Buck Weaver in a minute. And he's also been a recipient of the Ginny Valentine Badge of Courage Award, which he may be eligible for once again after he shares a little bit about his interesting side hobby on today's podcast. So Steve will tell you all about that and more. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight to be here, and I'm looking forward to having a lot of fun.
Good. Well, I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's start out by talking research. So what really sparked in you this interest in research and analytics? How did you get started?
Well, that's a great question. My background, I was an undergraduate in mathematics. And I liked, when I was a kid, I used to calculate, baseball averages a lot, when I really got pretty good at doing math.
Right.
It was like, he was 10 for 27. What's his batting average? Come on. So I really got good at that. And then I was a school teacher for a while. I taught math, junior high school and high school mathematics after I got out of college. And then I had a friend who came up to Boston. I was living in New York City. I grew up in New York City. I was living in New York City, and I had a friend who was up in Boston in a PhD program in sociology, it turns out. But she had gotten a master's degree in what was called communications research. And she said, "Oh, Steve, you're wasting your time being a school teacher. Come on, come up here and go to graduate school." So she introduced me to the chairman of her department, the master's degree. And after an hour conversation, he said, "You're accepted. You want to come?" And so I said, "Sure." Okay. So I was there, and then I went into the PhD in program in sociology like she did. And then sort of my career took a turn into market research. I answered a job to become a SAS programmer in 1979. Making the grand total of $20,000 a year as a SAS programmer. I did know nothing about SAS whatsoever. I just said, let me go interview, and they hired me, and sort of the rest is history. So that's how I got into marketing research as a SAS programmer.
Oh, that's great. But you obviously really connected with it and had a passion for it because.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the first people I worked with was a fellow named Al Silk, who at the time was the dean of the Sloan School at MIT.
Okay.
And he was one of the two authors of the original academic paper on the assessor new product forecasting model. So I worked with him quite a bit. We were developing film forecasting models, he and I, for Polaroid Corporation back when they existed.
Right.
And so we were doing surveys of people buying packs of film, and developing these film forecasting models depending upon how old the camera was and what type of camera it was. And I learned about things like hyperbolic decay, which essentially was the functional form of how you look at how people use film and other products over time, which is that they use it a lot in the beginning, and then the usage decays as time goes on. It decays off like that. And depending upon how much money you spent on the camera and how old the camera was, you were either the curve was higher or it was lower, but it was the same functional form for all of them. And that was really quite the eye opener, that you can really apply some really heavy, cool math, which I was familiar with.
Right.
Because I never took a stat course as an undergrad. I'll make that clear. I was into theoretical mathematics at the time.
Right.
But was like really some cool math, and you could actually solve some business problems. And people wanted to hear what I'd say once I finished analyzing this stuff. So it was a lot of fun. So that was kind of how I cut my teeth, doing film forecasting models for Polaroid.
That's really
back
cool.
in early 1980s. It really is when all that was happening.
That's really cool. Well,
Yeah.
people haven't stopped wanting to hear what you have to say. And I tell you, I really want to
Assuming I have something interesting to say, of course, but go ahead.
Now, I really want to hear what you have to say about this interesting side hobby of yours. So
that. Yeah, so that. Go ahead. You can reveal my foibles to your viewership, please.
Okay. Now Steve has quite an extensive shoe collection.
Right.
And is really attached to this shoe collection.
I must admit I am. And the reason it all started was when I was a kid, I was kind of like this, right now I'm say in excess of 200 pounds, and I won't go any further than that in terms of size. But when I was a kid, I was this beanpole, tall, white and skinny,
Right.
And I remember when I was a kid, I used to go buy shoes, and it was like every time I went to buy shoes, first of all, there was nothing to choose from because my feet were so big. And also at that time, kid sizes that I wore, you had to pay extra money for those shoes. They would charge like an extra $1 or $2. You buy a $12 pair of Tom McCann shoes, and you'd buy a $13 pair of Tom McCann shoes. So I sort of got into saying, well, every time as I got older and I got more income, I was able to afford more shoes. I said, look, if I see a pair of shoes that really fits well and I think are pretty cool, I'm going to buy them. So I'm somewhere between 50 and 60 pairs of shoes at the moment. That my wife just like she sees the shoebox come in the house from Amazon or someplace else, and she goes, "And how often are you going to wear those shoes?" Because I have ones that barely the soles have any wear on them whatsoever, but they're sitting in the closet and they're doing pretty well there. And I actually have my own closet just for my shoes. There's nothing in there. It's just a shoe closet. So it's an obsession, and no question about it. And I just bought, I think it was about a month ago, I bought another pair of shoes. But so it's, it's just something that kind of comes naturally to me. I mean, the other thing that goes with that is, since I'm so big, I've had to get clothes, roughly speaking, custom made.
Right.
And one thing that this COVID thing has done is, you read about all the people who are, the women who are around in leggings, the men who are sitting around in their gym shorts. Well, I haven't worn a sports jacket or a suit in, was it 18 months, 16 months at this point. So my wife has been getting moth repellent for the closet, keep them away from my clothes. But it's a wonderful thing. So the shoes are definitely obsession, and I have bookmarked probably a dozen different sites for buying shoes. So anybody watching this, you want to know where to buy some cool shoes, follow the email, but that Matt'll have. He'll connect you with me.
Do you have a personal favorite that you've got some kind of real attachment to?
Well, actually,
is it functional?
Yeah, no. They're very. So it was funny because a friend of mine said, "Well, you must have a lot of wingtips," and I'm like, "No, I'm not conservative like that. I have a pair of shoes that were made in Spain. They're what do they call them? Chelsea boots.
Okay.
And the color is sort of a reddish, maroonish kind of thing. They're very cool. They're very, very slim and. They're very, very nice. I really like those shoes. Those are one of my favorites. But I don't have much occasion to wear them these days. Right now I'm sitting here in running shorts and a pair of sneakers. You can see below. But yeah, so what a disappointment. I'm so able to be able to go outside and go see a client and have to wear my red Chelsea boots.
Yeah, so you've been deprived of this outlet. So
I know it's been hard. It's been very difficult. It's been a very difficult time, living with these disappointments. But there we are.
I have one last question about the shoes.
Sure. Just one, please. Go ahead.
Just one more, and then we'll move on from the shoes.
Sure, of course.
Have there ever been any occasions where your interest in hobby and shoes has intersected with your market research career?
Oh, geez. Well, actually, the only time I can really remember was there's a conference, and I forget the name of the conference, that gets held in Spain every year, and
Okay.
it's usually in the springtime or the fall. I can't remember which, but anyway,
Okay.
one year they had the conference in Porto, not Spain, excuse me, in Portugal. It was in Porto, Portugal, which is in the northern part of Portugal, above Lisbon. And it turns out the place that makes those Chelsea boots, yeah, their headquarters and factory is in Porto. Unfortunately, I couldn't go, but I made direct contact with the woman who's the international marketing manager, who is the daughter of the owner of the factory. And I had her send me a pair of shoes through the mail because I couldn't go. But yes, that's the only time I can really remember the two sort of intersecting with one another. But this is pretty silly, Matt. This is silly.
Hey, it's kind of rock and roll.
It is. That's what it's all about, rock and roll, right, Matt? This is what it is. It's all about rock and roll.
That's right. Okay, so
sex and drugs and rock and roll. Remember the song?
And Chelsea boots.
And Chelsea boots.
Okay. So
yes.
So back to research. I mean,
from the sublime to the ridiculous, or from the ridiculous to the sublime. I think it probably goes that way. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's right. So you have done so much and seen so much in the world of analytics.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, what really is maybe the current state of analytics and maybe where you see it headed?
Cool. That's a great question. And one of the things that also interests me is history. So I like reading about history. I like when I go to visit someplace, I like to read the history of where I go. And let me tell you a little story about the history of marketing research, which I'm going to guess that not a whole lot of your viewers know about. Let's hear it. Yes. So you mentioned the Buck Weaver Award, and this is the time I'm going to touch on Buck. Buck's actual name was Henry Grady Weaver. And so what happened was, as I mentioned, I had done some work with folks from MIT. And MIT, as I said, is associated with, is part of the Sloan School of Business is at MIT. Right. And Sloan is Alfred Sloan, who is the guy who started General Motors. Was the big guy who talks about differentiation of cars and all that sort of stuff. And it turns out that one of the professors at MIT had a friend who was the head of market research at General Motors, a fellow named Vince Barabo, who was the head of market research. Vince had actually been head of market research at Xerox in its heyday, and Vince was also head of the U.S. Census, so he was quite an accomplished researcher. And the way the story goes is that Vince was sort of scrounging around in the library, if you will, at General Motors, and then the library was filled with all sorts of old reports and stuff. And he happened upon this gentleman, Henry Grady Buck Weaver.
Okay.
And so they did a little bit of investigation, and what they found was that Buck was really quite a man ahead of his time. And what I'm going to show you is, I'm going to take control of the screen, if I may.
Sure.
And show you the fact that, whoops, can you see this?
Yep, got it.
Cool. You can see that Buck, that's him sitting behind the desk, and he's got some surveys on his desk. Time magazine, November 1938. And I dare you to name another market researcher who was on the cover of Time magazine. Wow. I suspect perhaps A.C. Nielsen himself may have been on the cover at some point. But this is the cover of Time magazine, 1938, and it says General Motors Henry Grady Weaver, and there's something you can't read very well below it, which it says 2 million opinions make a fact. I love it.
That's great.
Now, what did he used to do? Well, it turns out that what Buck did was he used to send out mail surveys by the millions to people, and he would get them back, and he would use them to help Alfred Sloan make decisions about what to do, about which cars to do, styling, and so on. And the 1930s was a really important time in those years, because they were very much interested in the styling of cars. Remember, right. Henry Ford had the Model T, which was basically, any color you want as long as it's black. And what they were looking to do was to, come up with this whole differentiation of cars with different things. And also, the 30s was a time of, how shall we say, we had left it was kind of like sort of perhaps the last throes of the Depression, although people didn't know it at the time. And incomes were rising, and so they were very interested in finding out what people had to say. And so what I'm going to show you, I have some copies of some of the surveys that he sent out. So for example, whoops, come on, there you go. You can see on the left in green, this is the survey itself. It's a little booklet, fits in a regular envelope. Your car as you would build it. And along the side, it says the proving ground of public opinion. And then below it, it says, there's only one person qualified to say just what the motorist prefers. And that person is the motorist himself. God bless, right?
Wow.
And then, so for example, where do you want to mount your spare wheel? You want to spare at the rear? You want it on the fender? You want it enclosed at the rear? How do you feel the tendency towards streamlining? Look at that, fast planes, fast boats, fast cars. And I love this sort of stuff. He all the surveys, there's always a little ditty, a little statement. Art is not a thing separate and apart. Art is only the best way of doing things. And Elbert Hubbard said that, whoever the heck Elbert Hubbard was. Here's another one from the survey. What's your preference on the rear contours, considering appearance only? And this is the one to be not this. So what's the front? How do you want the front? And this right here is the starter-ator, for the car.
Starter-ator.
The starter-ator. Yeah, you have your carburetor. Well, you've also got a starter-ator. So they had the starter-ator of the car. And this one is my famous, which is, what are they worth to you? And notice the scale here is balancing off desirability versus cost. And so for adjustable seats, would you like to pay $10 or $20 or $30? How much is it worth to you? Tell us how much money you would pay extra to get, a starter-ator or an independent suspension. So I think it's really, when I look at all this, I said to myself, first of all, more things change, the more they remain the same.
Right.
There's so much, I'm going to stop the share. There's so much, that's so much the same of what he was doing. We're just doing it sort of, faster and perhaps more sophisticated, and we're providing analytic models to a lot of this. But a lot of the same kinds of things are important. We want to know what consumer needs are. And I don't think going into the future it's going to change any. We still have no way of knowing exactly what people want, other than perhaps to ask them or to look at what they do. Right. And so, I think our profession of market research and marketing analytics is going to continue to need to do that, perhaps at scale, and that's a whole other discussion. But certainly finding out what people want, satisfying wants and needs, is what we're all about and what we should be concentrating on in the future.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to see that booklet and the types of questions that are asked. Like you said, it doesn't feel like it's over 80 years old, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's remarkable. Yeah. And I would encourage folks who want to see these surveys. I bought this off of eBay. So you can go to eBay, and look for opinion survey General Motors. And I think I spent like $10 to get I have 2 or 3 of them, but they're old, they're still around. Some of them may be filled out, some of them not filled out. But if you want to have one for your collection, it's a cool thing to have, that's for sure, to show it around.
Cool. That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So Steve, this is a podcast. So
yes, sir.
Maybe you listen to other podcasts, or maybe you don't. I don't know. But thinking about the research space, what other sources have you found useful or do you consult currently?
Are you talking about like books and stuff like that, or?
Yeah, that's
just
fine.
I actually yes, thanks. One of the things that I find that's sort of I find interesting. Of course, I find me interesting, but did you know people's favorite subjects are themselves? I don't know if you're aware of that.
Let's pick that one up over the years.
Yes. I actually like to read the academic literature, and I know there are folks who don't like to read the academic literature because you're saying, who needs to know how to add an additional angel on the head of that particular pin. But for me, it's sort of a way to sort of jumpstart my thinking about things. And I'll give you an example. When I first started in marketing research, I was working at a company that actually had, so this was after my time being a SAS programmer.
Right.
The next job I had, they had a library, and this was a library of journals, excuse me. And I discovered in there the Journal of Marketing Research, which I'd never seen before. I'd never thought of there was such a thing. I discovered it, and I became acquainted with the work of a gentleman named Paul Green. Now, some of you may not know who Paul Green is, but Paul Green, well, let me put it this way: when academics cite the work of another academic, the other academic gets a point, so to speak. All right, and so that's the way they kind of decide, the pecking order. Somebody who gets cited a lot by other people is more influential. All right.
Right.
So at that time, Paul Green sort of had like 5,000 points, which was like way above anybody else. And number two was like at 3,000 points. So he was just so far ahead of everybody else. So Paul was on the faculty at the Wharton School. And Paul, you could say that he invented conjoint analysis, among other things. And so when I was first starting in the business, I used to read articles and especially try to find articles about Paul Green, because invariably, given that he had 5,000 points, he wrote about a lot of different stuff.
Right.
And he always had an idea. And I always said, oh, that's pretty cool. He's a clever fellow. That's Paul Green. And so I would look at what he did, and I say, yeah, is there any way I know how to do it? Or are there limitations to what I could do about to what he did? And so on. So he became my idol for a long time, to be able to look at this. And unfortunately, he passed away several years ago. But he was a very, very talented guy. And I encourage anybody, if they're looking sort of at the history of market research again, if they want to look at anything on how to do anything, any methodological or research, discover Paul Green, Paul E. Green, from the Wharton School. So definitely reading the academic literature. Now I just read lots of stuff, and every once in a while I find something that's really cool and interesting, and and other times I look at it and I go, no, this isn't worth paying more attention to. So it varies quite a bit. Right?
Sure. Sure. Good. And I think when we spoke before, there was a text that you really
yeah. Actually, there's really if I would make a suggestion of 3 marketing textbooks or 3 textbooks on research that I would suggest people read. The first one I would suggest is an old book, one that I used in graduate school, but I looked it up on Amazon and it's still being used. It's still out there. It's called Foundations of Behavioral Research. And the author is Kerlinger, Kerlanger. And that covers everything from research design and how to do scales and how to test and experimental design, non-experimental design. It's a pretty, 400 or 500 page book, but for me, it was the Bible. And that's how I learned to do research, really, when you get down, it was that particular book.
Cool.
Second one I find near and dear is a book called Market Segmentation by Michel Wedel. Michel is Michel, not ELLE. He's a man. Wedel he's Dutch, and he teaches University of Maryland. And his co-author is Wagner Kamakura, who's a marketing professor at I think he's at Rice University down in Texas. So they, as far as I'm concerned, wrote the definitive book on doing market segmentation. And the final one's a fairly new book. It's called Statistical Rethinking. And it's a book that teaches statistics, but from a Bayesian perspective.
Okay.
And it turns out, I don't remember the fellow's, who's the author. I think it's, well, I won't even try and remember his name. But one of the cool things is those of you who are listening, who are learning R or R-stan, all the examples in the book are in R and R-stan. So you can really test it out and do stuff. And I've seen a lot of the reviews of the book I've seen really like it, and I've had an enjoyable reading of it also. It's all the good stuff. Taking the bathroom at night helps you go to sleep, and so read it. Right. Silly. Yes.
Statistical rethinking. So I'll post a link to that.
Statistical rethinking. Yeah, please do. So that's kind of like what I'm all about here. it's fun to do research. As you can see, I got a lot of my textbooks and other books behind me that I like to read. And unfortunately, I haven't been in my office for years. Not a year, so it feels like years. It's only been months. I'm sorry, it's only been months. This is just my home office. I'm in here today, and it's an interesting life being a researcher. That's for sure. It's been a lot of interesting stuff been
Yes,
done over the
indeed.
years.
Absolutely. All right. So this is
Yeah,
the Rock and Roll Research Podcast, of course. So
this is the penultimate right here. Yes.
I gotta know, Steve. So you're stranded on a desert island. You've got 3 records of your
Yep.
choosing to keep you
Yep.
company for the rest of your days.
Okay.
Records.
What are they? Well, I'm going to be a bit of an apostate in that not all 3 are rock and roll records would be classified as rock and roll.
Totally fine.
Okay. So the first one will be rock and roll, which is Abbey Road. I mean,
yeah, classic.
We're talking just it's beyond classic. I mean, it's everything else pales in comparison as far as I'm concerned. I was thinking of doing the White Album, but I decided to go with Abbey Road instead because Paul's walking around without his shoes on the cover of the album, and at that time, Paul had died. I don't know if you remember the Paul is dead controversy. Yeah. So everybody thought the fact that Paul didn't have his shoes on meant that Paul really was dead. I remember when I was in college when this happened. I was an undergraduate, and listening to the conspiracy theories kind of reminds me of QAnon. In terms of the crazy conspiracies, Paul died and who killed him, and anyway, but Paul turns out is doing quite well. So that's my first one. The second one is when I was an undergraduate. Again, my sister was going out with this fellow who was so I was actually, I think he's even before I was an undergrad. I think it was junior high school or something like that. And my sister was going out with this fellow who was sort of a jazz and classical buff. He didn't know anything about popular rock and roll music, and he introduced me to Beethoven. And so I am a big lover of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, and the particular one I suggest people might want to pick up on is the one where Leonard Bernstein is having his last concert at Tanglewood in Western Massachusetts. So it's a live concert. Leonard Bernstein is conducting. They didn't take out extraneous noises. It was all, he was in his last stages of his life. He was, we're not doing very well. Sure. And you can hear the coughs of the people and people sneezing and stuff on it, but it's Bernstein and Beethoven is just ridiculously good. So that's the second one. Yeah, and then the third one is another live concert. There's an Italian singer by the name of Paolo Conti. That's Paolo, and last name is Conte. And he's sort of like the Tom Waite of Italy, who's got a really gravelly voice. Yeah. And Paolo was a lawyer till he was in his 50s, and then he decided to become a full-time singer. So he's in his low 80s. I think he's 83 or 84 at this point. But he did a live concert at the Arena in Verona, Italy. Now, if you're not familiar with Verona, Italy, I fortunately I've had the good fortune to go there. Verona, as you know, was the setting for 2 of Shakespeare's plays. One was Two Men and Gentlemen of Verona, and the other was Romeo and Juliet. And so actually, when you go to Verona, you could supposedly see the balcony where, she was, and he was talking to her like that. But Verona has the largest sort of intact Roman amphitheater in the world. It's 25,000 people. And in summertime, they do live opera or other kinds of concerts there. So we went there and saw, my wife and I went there and we saw, I think it was the opera Tosca. And it was just like, me and 20,000 of my closest friends watching the opera. What happened, unfortunately, is starting to rain. And so what happens is when it rains, because it's outdoors, all the musicians left to go inside because, you're playing a Stradivarius, you don't want to get wet. Exactly. And all the people who are the dancers don't want to slip and fall on their butt. So the thing ended prematurely, if you will. But it was just an amazing experience. I suggest everybody, if they have the opportunity, summertime, Verona, Italy. So those are 3: Abbey Road, Beethoven 7th, and Paolo Conti live at the opera in Verona.
Well, those are great choices. Great choices. Surprisingly, that's actually the first Beatles mention, I want to say, so far in 30 plus episodes.
No kidding.
On the podcast. So
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm glad to be the first, but I sort of, have to admonish all the others for not having at least one Beatles record. Please, come on.
Well, good choices, Steve, and
Thank you, sir.
really great to catch up as always. Thanks so much for your wisdom, well earned over the years in market research, and a little insight into your shoe.
My shoes,
Your
my
shoes.
obsessions.
Yeah.
All right.
All right,
Thank you
Steve.
so much, Matt. This has been great. I really enjoyed it. All right. Be well. And to all your listeners, you be well as well. Mask up.
And you also be well, Steve, and rock and roll.
Rock and roll.